But the first thing that I really want to talk about is timelines. So when it comes down to timelines, God is the master timeline builder. And so God is the one who actually puts out how he wants things to go. And when you usually plan things, there's always an ordered step and an order means by which you get to that, is my broadcast is called on YouTube, that end game. And so there are certain steps that you are going to follow. There's certain things that you're going to put in place. And there's certain things that happen based on another thing happening. Now, when you get off into the, what is it? The second day, third day of creation, where he set the stars and the sun in place. It says that he set the stars, the sun, all those things in place for seasons, for times, for warnings, for alerts. And I like to say the big old alarm clock. Anytime you look at an alarm clock and you look at the way that a clock is made up, one of the technological advances that we had with the clock was to make it an alarm clock so that it would be able to be preset to a certain time so that when that time actually comes, an alarm would go off. And so such is the premise that we're seeing here. Now, to go even further, we're in America, so we're on something called the Gregorian calendar. It's a calendar that uses both lunar and solar data. It uses things that happen in the sun, it uses things that happen in the moon, and it determines dates based of that. That's where we get our 365-day year calendar with our leap year every 4 years. Islam, the Muslims, they use a completely lunar calendar. So their entire calendar is based off of events that happen around the lunar cycles. So the full moons, the new moons, things like that. Now, the Hebrew people, I'm sorry, the Jewish people, Israel, they go completely by a solar calendar. So the sun is what sets all of their um, feasts, their times, things like their convocations. And what I love about their feast, that word feast is translated to appointed time. I believe that word is moed, Moed, and that word is actually translated to appointed time. And so these are appointed times. And there are certain things that have happened in the Jewish calendar, now this year being 5782, I believe, somewhere around there. Yeah, 5782, something like that. These are actual, as the word holy convocation, convocation in Hebrew means dress rehearsal. And low hanging fruit, Passover. When Passover happened, by the time Jesus was crucified on Passover, just so happens, he didn't get up on the cross on Passover and say, "Oh, it's Passover. It's time for me to be the sacrificial lamb." That's not how that happened. A very predetermined, converging set of events came together and they caused him to be crucified, even though it was already prophesied that he would be crucified. This is how detailed and how powerful God's set times and days are. He knew that Passover would eventually only be a dress rehearsal for the real Passover, for the day that sin would really be forgiven on the earth. See, at that time, there was a microcosm going on in Egypt. And when the children of Israel, they put that blood on the doorpost, um, before the spirit of death came through to take the firstborn of all Egypt, everyone that was in Egypt, that was a harbinger. It was a foreshadowing. It was a shadow to the type. And so, what was the type? The type was Christ. The blood that had to be applied to the doorpost, it had to be a lamb, and it had to be a sacrificial lamb. And it had to be the kind of lamb that was without spot, without blemish, and it had to be the very best that was offered. And so we have here on Passover so many years later. Some could say 2,000 years later. Some could say 1,500 years later. We don't really know how many Passovers after the original Passover Jesus was sacrificed as a sacrificial lamb. Now, if you want to get even more deeper and you want to give God even more glory, what you're going to do is you're going to look at why these accounts would say things along the lines of, and at the third hour, at the sixth hour, and at the ninth hour, because it was at the third hour, the sixth hour, and the ninth hour that the sacrificial lamb, much like Jesus, was prepared at the third hour. He was bound at the sixth hour, and he was sacrificed, and it was finished at the ninth hour. The ninth hour. That's what we call coming through in the clutch at the ninth hour. He's a ninth hour kind of God. And so there is little variance when it comes to other events. And so as I was studying, and as I have been studying now for about the past 10 years, writing this book 7 years ago, it became abundantly clear that this Hebrew calendar is on to something. Now, the Hebrew calendar also works on a cycle of sevens. And so you look at every 7 year cycle. So this is where the American bankruptcy law comes from. When 7 years is up, you're released from your debt. And this is the cycle that you find in Leviticus about relieving debt and things like that every 7 years. But then there's 7 year cycles. There's 7 times 7, and that's 49. And so they have something called a Shemitah cycle. Every 7 years is called a Shemitah cycle. But those 7 years, when they get to the seventh cycle of that year, that is called the 50th year. It's the first year of the new 49 year cycle. Okay. Things really get interesting on that first Shemitah cycle year. On that either 8th year, so you have 7 years, but then on the first year of the next 7 year cycle, they call it the 8th year. But the first year of the next Shemitah cycle, things happen. And there is a long history of things happening. Now, not only do things happen on that first year, but I just alluded that it happens on the first year of the Jubilee cycle. So every 49 years, that next year, the 50th year, which is the first year of the next 49 cycle, that's called a year of Jubilee. That's a grand release. And all kinds of things happen on them days. And so I jotted down a few dates here because I just want you all to understand the improbability that this kind of history could happen repeatedly for these many years without it being some truth accredited to the God who says wrote it. So the first temple was destroyed in 586 BC. That was a year one. Keep going on. 1945, you got Hiroshima. 1966, Six-Day War. 1973. Now I want you to know that these are all they're just about 7 years apart, and each one of these occurrences are happening on year one of the next cycle. Not on year 6, not on year 7, but on year one. So every 7 year cycle, on the first year of that cycle, something extraordinary for the world or for Israel actually happens. So I'm going to go back into here. 1966 was the Six-Day War. That's when Israel had to fight for their land, and which is still disputed to today. That's where the Gaza War and all that comes in. 1973, which was actually a year of Jubilee, that's the Yom Kippur War. 1973, year of Jubilee. So 50 years later will be another year of Jubilee. 2023 is a year of Jubilee. Now, the Yom Kippur War was very big in Israel's history. It was big for them. Didn't so much hit everywhere else. There was coverage, worldwide. We're going to go another 7 years further to the Iraq nuclear war. 1987 was the first Intifada. 1994 was the Israel-Jordan peace treaty. 2001, these are iterations of 7 years. Every 7 years, something major is happening. The Quartet of Countries to Divide Israel came about. 2008, we're also going to talk about 2001, was September 11th. That was also the year of a huge, disastrous stock crash and all kinds of economic things that went on. But that was really the only thing going on. That's key. I want you all to remember that. Only those things were going on. There, so 2001, 2008, 7 years later, we have another stock market crash. We have the Gaza war. And that is the time that those blood moons were doing what they were doing. Then 2015, 2016, a lot of things happened. Now, the one thing that I keep in my mind is that the Jewish calendar, for all purposes and intents, is anywhere from 2 to 5 years off. And the one thing, as I'm getting ready to peel back some of the layers on these seals, the one thing that I really noticed is that the first seal, and I believe that, something between 2013 and 2016 happened that was really first sealish. I'm not going to attempt to pinpoint that, but I do know that things began to change during that time. The very first thing I want you to know that changed was in 2013. I'll never forget it. It was May 23rd, 2013. And God bless President Obama. He signed the Marriage Equality Act into law in the United States. That opened a door that I don't think will ever be able to close. And the fallout from it is going to actually be something that we are not ready for, and with all our hearts is hoping was not true. We're going to get into that. But then 7 years later is 22, 23 this year.